Welcome back, everybody. I'm really happy with the work you've done in the HTML assignment. And so we're going to build on that same HTML document that you've made so far. Make sure you've got all the characteristics in the HTML that you've worked on so far, and you're going to continue to use that. So you'll duplicate it and put the naming convention on the folder that you put your HTML and image files inside of. So remember, what I'm talking about now is your file structure. When you create a website, you're going to have the overall folder that's going to contain your HTML document, your images folder, and when you watch this video, you'll see that you'll also have a CSS folder inside of that, and you'll zip that overall project folder and have the naming convention on that folder, which is what you did when you turned in just this HTML with the images folder inside of it this time. So you're familiar with that already. So that's what you're going to do. I'm going to go over CSS now, and you'll see how to start adding some aesthetics to this HTML document that you've done. And after you've done that, I will talk to you a little bit more at the end of this video about what I want you to turn into me this week to show me that you understand the CSS instruction that I've given you this far. So here comes some CSS instruction and a little review of the HTML, and I'll be back after that to talk about what I exactly want you to turn into me this week to show that you are understanding the beginnings of the CSS.
Okay, everybody, so we've now covered some real basic HTML, and we are going to move on and take a look at cascading style sheets, or CSS. So one way to think about all of this is the appearance of your site. So your HTML that we've done already is designed to put content up on your site. So if you look at what we've created so far, this is the HTML document right here, and this is the way the site looks. And right now it's pretty plain except for the images. Really the only color is the color of the hyperlinks. They sort of stand out and are underlined, and that's just natural for the hyperlinks to have sort of a different color, and even before and after they've been clicked on, your browser will affect the color of them. The different font sizes of the headings is controlled by the H1, H2, and H3 HTML tags. So we've got that. If we just run back through what we covered in HTML, we talked about how to create an HTML document using Notepad or TextEdit, depending on what system you're on. And then we talked about just the basic headers, or rather the basic tags to create an HTML document, and that all of the content of your HTML document exists inside of the body tags. We have talked about how to save the file on your computer. And so these are the must-haves that we just talked about. Then we talked about headers. And if you look over here in the HTML, you've got these different headers. So H1, the biggest header says bacon here, and that's tagged as H1. H2 is a medium tag, bacon is delicious. And then we don't use H3 until down here, which says bacon is good. So you can see the descending size of the heading fonts, and that they are bolded as opposed to the text inside of the paragraphs. Then we put some lorem ipsum inside of those paragraphs that we created with the paragraph tag. And I actually also added a title to the paragraphs, so that the tooltip title, so if we go back over here to index and I hover over the paragraph, you see bacon comes up, and that's because inside of the paragraph tag I added that title property or attribute, which is right here. So I added a title attribute, which is, the syntax is like this, and I put in bacon so you can see it right here. I added unordered lists. So here's our unordered lists. For each of the foods, I put in an unordered list of things that they're good on, and those show up here with bullets by default. I also put in an ordered list, 1, 2, 3, and if you look down here at the bottom, here is the ordered list, and I put a H3 tag, or rather, over my ordered list, I put a H1 tag, and then the ordered list, and so of course that's going to have numbers, and it's my ranking of the foods, and here's that. I have affected the height and width of our images. So when you look at the image sources here, I made them a little smaller. And so I had to look at the properties of the images first to make sure I wouldn't distort the images when I changed the height and width of them. And for the primary images, I just made them about half as big, the bacon and the cheese. But the veggies was already a little smaller, so I reduced it by 1/4 and got some uniformity in the sizes of the images. And then if you look here, so 440 by 235, 400 by 208, and 349 by 191. Part of the deal here is there's a white edge around the cheese, so it actually needed to be reduced a little differently to sort of fit in. Or, I mean, the bacon was, no, it was a ping, but the width of it is a little bit different. So anyway, I had to kind of play around with the sizes of the images to get them to look right. Okay. All right. So now that we've done that HTML, we want to start putting some CSS in. Oh, one more thing. We had comments in here. And comments don't show up when you render your image in the browser. So here, for example, let's say I had a client that was paying me to create this site. I could put these comments that say stuff like, the client said put stuff about bacon in this part, but that's not going to show up anywhere in the actual site. Okay, let's see if I missed anything else that we covered. We did hyperlinks with the href attribute. And so we've got these hyperlinks that read bacon ipsum, and in the site, if you click on that, you'll go to the bacon ipsum site. So we did hyperlinks, and I think that covers. We inserted the images. So in addition to just sizes, we had to put the image source attribute in here in that image tag so that the images themselves show up inside of the document. Yeah, okay. So that's everything that we've covered so far. So what we've got is this relatively boring looking site. It's got some content, and it's got of various types of content, and some differentiation of the headings and sections, but there's not really much color to it. It's not particularly nice looking. So we want to add some CSS or cascading style sheets to give it some aesthetics. And so there's 3 different ways that you can put CSS into your HTML. You're going to essentially put it into your HTML, but let me explain further. So there's inline CSS code, which is going to be just for a specific HTML tag. So let's say I wanted to put blue text and a gray background just on a particular header. So I could add this CSS styling right into the header tag itself. Okay, so you see I've got this style, so I'm style equals, and then in quotation marks, these are actually the CSS rules that I want to add to that header. So let's say I just copy this, and then I'm going to add that into, let's just put it into this first header, okay? So it's inside of the opening HTML tag, the H1 opener. All right, so now I've added that in, so it's the same here, H1, and then I've put in the background And so the background color, and then here just plain color refers to text in CSS, but we'll talk about that in a minute. So I've added that in there, and now I'll save my HTML document and re-render it over here. Okay, and now you see I've added that gray background, and I've turned the text to blue. Okay, so that's one way we can do that. I'm going to take that back out. And save it just as it was before, and let's go ahead and refresh it. Okay, so that's gone now. So then another way that you can add HTML is put in a heading section, and your HTML documents are going to need headers, and we haven't done that yet because of the HTML that we didn't include any elements that we needed in a heading section. So headers now this, remember, this is the head section of the HTML document, not a head tag inside of the body of the HTML itself. So this head section doesn't actually show up when you render the HTML document, because remember, everything that shows up inside is inside of the body tags. But let's add this head section. And now what I'm going to do is add this style element that says the entire body of the website is going to have a light gray background color, and the text is going to be blue. Okay, so I'm going to go up here. The header is before the body tag, but of course after the two must-have statements, the HTML tags itself and the doc type HTML. So I'm just going to paste this in there. So now I've got that header. See, head style. The style is going to be referring to the CSS, and then I've just changed this one element, right? So I'm going to go ahead and save that. Go back over here and re-render. Okay. So now everything has that light gray background and the blue color on the text. Okay. Now let's talk about the third way that you can add CSS, and that is going to link an external CSS file. All right. So in order to do that, you're now going to have to, with whichever text editor you're using, you're going to have to create a new document, and you're going to have to make sure that the file extension is .css. All right. And you're going to put this link to the style sheet inside of your header. So the syntax of that is your first link. So you're telling your HTML document that you're linking it to another document. Okay. And it's relating to a style sheet. Okay. And so that it's a text document that is CSS extension, right? And then the href, which you've used before, it's going to tell it where to find it. All right. So this will be a folder, just like we had the images folder inside of, so here is our folder that we created before. Remember, we had the naming convention on it. We had a folder called images, and then your HTML document is called index. That's what you've created previously. We're going to need to create a new folder. So I'm going to go right here, and I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to title that folder as CSS. Okay, and that's because that's what I'm calling it here. And that's what you want to do, because you want to know that your CSS is inside of the folder called CSS. Now I need to create a new plain document that's going to be with the extension of CSS. Okay, so if I'm over here, my text editor, file, new. Okay, and then file. We're going to save it, and we're going to call this, I think we called it, so food style. You should still have those same properties that you set up in your text editor, because you don't want any sort of formatting inside of it. And that's what we set up when we saved the document before, but I'm going to call it foodstyle.css. And then make sure that I'm going to place that inside of the folder. So I'm looking for my desktop. So I need to open this up so I can see my desktop. And I want to go here and inside of that CSS folder, and then I'm going to save. And make sure that I used CSS, and I'm going to look inside of that CSS folder. And look also, it's not now inside of the project folder. It's separated it. So I'm going to drop it inside of there to make sure that in the hierarchy I have the main folder, and then inside of that I have my HTML document, my images folder, and the CSS folder. And then inside of the CSS folder, I've got this food title document, which is CSS. I just want to get info to make sure that it's saved the way I wanted it to. And it looks like we are good to go. Yeah. All right. Looks right to me. We'll see. Okay, so I've created that CSS document called food style. And I'm open with, and I'm going to use text edit, and there it is. So now I have this CSS document. So I've got this is my HTML, this is my CSS, and my CSS doesn't have anything in it yet. So let's link my HTML to the CSS document, the food style CSS. So I'm going to copy this, go over to my header, and I'm going to replace this with the CSS link. So I did have my CSS formatting inside of the header, and now I'm not. All I'm going to have in that header is a link telling it, go see what's on this CSS document, foodstyle.css. Okay? I'm going to save that change. And now my index, when I refresh, okay, so the formatting's gone because there's no formatting in this CSS document right now. So I need to put some in there if I want to change the actual the formatting of the site. All right, so now we've done that part. Let's talk about CSS rules. A CSS rule consists of a selector and a declaration block. So here's your selector. Right now, that's H1 on this example. So that means that this CSS declaration block right here is only referring to H1 headings. All right. So let's just do that and show you what that means. Go over here. And place that rule in here. Save. Dex. Okay. Didn't change anything yet because we don't have the formatting of the CSS document done right yet. So it's actually not the problem with the CSS. The CSS is just fine. The issue that we've got is over in our HTML with the link to the CSS document. So beware copying, pasting, right? So if we look at the CSS, should just be, inside the head should just be this, but I left the style reference that you would use in this example. So if you're doing internal CSS and you're doing the styling inside of the head, then you've got this opening style and closing style tag. But when you are actually placing a link inside using the external CSS, you don't use the style reference. So I'll just go ahead and erase this and this as well. And now I've just got the regular reference. And again, if I open up this Finder, you can see that I've got the CSS folder and then the food style CSS inside of it. And here, href CSS folder, foodstyle.css. So we're good there. And make sure I saved it. And then we're going to go back over to the Finder. And I'm just opening up the index document. I'm using Safari as my browser. And there it is. And so now if we look at the CSS, the color is green, and I set a font size to for the H1. So as we were talking about, my selector is H1. So when I do that, all of my H1 headers are now going to be green with a font size of 22 pixels. And you look over here, there they are. So now at 22 pixels, those headers are actually smaller than the H2 headers. All right. So now we've added external CSS. External CSS is the way to go, folks, because when you do that, you can then use that same CSS styling repeatedly on different pages without having to redo the CSS. And additionally, it will allow uniformity between all the pages you do that way. So there's no chance of you changing some elements so that things don't look the same. Okay. Now, your selectors are what is being styled, right? So, headers are going to be styled here. You can also choose different kinds of selectors. So I used an element selector in this example. Okay, I used H1, so all the H1 headers. But you can also insert an ID into your HTML. So I could call this H1 by the ID head name, right? And then the text would be here. And that would mean only elements that I had added this ID to. And so it could be, I could have paragraphs that also had that same ID. You add this ID, so any element that has that ID would then be styled with those properties, okay? And then you could also add a class, right? So you could create a class that is, here I call it class name. So anything that had that particular class name would have those properties, okay? So, you can sort of choose when you're working on different sites whether you would like to identify the elements by just the properties or by ID or by class. So all H1s are going to be in class, are going to have this class now. Or you could add that, you can do dot class name and style it here, or hashtag and the actual ID. So these are the different ways that you can choose selectors. All right, colors. So in this one that we did, we just colored the text green. And if you look through here, you can eventually find green. There's green. And there's CSS color names that you can use where you just type in the actual name of the color. And that's not the only way that you can select colors. You can also choose the hexadecimal code to select colors. The reason I like to use the name is because it makes your CSS more readable, right? Now when I read that, I know I'm coloring this green. But if I choose to, give this 006600 value, unless I've memorized all the hexadecimal codes, when I read through my CSS, I may not know what that means. Okay, so again, the formatting for text color in terms of your declaration block, which is the second part, which is inside of the curly brackets, is going to be color, colon, and then green. The background color is going to be background color, and then whatever color you're deciding to use. All right, so if we look now at my rules here, I've added all of my H1 headings are going to have green text and they're going to have a font size of 22. Okay, I could choose to change, instead of adjusting the font size, because remember the font size was problematic because now the H1 font was smaller than the fonts for H2. So I could decide, oh, I don't want to do that with the font size, but I do want to change the background color of those headers. I'm going to change it to light blue. So now if I do this, inside of this same this same rule, I'm going to add this second property and replace the other one, and I'll go File, Save. And so now, if I refresh, you can see that all of these headers are now going to have that light blue background along with the same green color. Fonts. So when you're adjusting fonts, there are two different types of font families. There's generic families, and there are 5 of them. There's serif, which tend to have finishing strokes and flared and tapered ends. You can kind of see they're a little fancier looking in a sense. Then there's sans serif. Times New Roman is a pretty famous, the one you guys use all the time. That's a serif. Then there's sans serif, which are sort of plainer strokes without the ends on them, like this Montserrat here example. There are cursive strokes that generally the strokes are connected. The characters are connected like in cursive writing. There are fantasy generic families, which are much fancier and decorative looking, but they are representational of characters, not like wingdings and stuff like that you see that actually don't look like letters at all. The fantasy generic family letters are just sort of decorative, but still look like letters. And then monospace, all the glyphs have a fixed width. Okay, so here's monospace and courier, which a lot of times you might use to type a paper, is a monospace font. Okay, so those generic families refer to sort of the qualities of the letters, but then there are the specific font families instead of generic families, and they have names like Times New Roman or Arial, and it's going to specifically refer to that font. In terms of like Times New Roman, there are many serif fonts and there are many sans serif fonts. Okay, when you declare a font family, like for example, if you're going to declare a font family for all of your paragraphs and you want it to all be Times New Roman, you are going to want to declare more than, you're going to create like a string of names. So here I put in Times New Roman. Your operating system is going to have the fonts inside of it, unless you do some stuff that we can talk about later, where you can actually add some true type font files to your website, so that in the event that the operating system doesn't have that font, it can still be rendered inside of the site because you put that file in there just like you would an image. But we're not going there yet. Right now we're going to try and stick with some of the fonts that are generally in things. So let's say we want all of our paragraphs to be in Times New Roman. Okay, so here we're creating this rule where we're setting it up this way. And this is just saying that if Times New Roman's not in there, declare it in whatever generic family, whatever serif font might be present inside of the operating system. And that just covers you in case your user is working in an operating system that doesn't have Times New Roman. So if I go over here now and I go ahead and add this rule and save, go over to the index, I think we might already be in Times New Roman, so you're not going to get anything different. Let's see if courier, let's find courier. And I'll go here. So I'll change Times New Roman to courier. File, save. This is a little bit touchier because, again, Yeah. Okay. So Courier is available, and we would actually change this to sans serif because Courier is a sans serif font. So if the computer didn't have Courier, it would change it to a different sans serif. But here you can see now instead of Times New Roman, which is what the font that everything else is rendered in, now my paragraphs are showing up as rendered in Courier. Okay. So that's just a little bit about how you change your fonts. Now, you can also do font styles, and font style is mainly when you're working in CSS to give an italic property to something. So you set a font style property if you want for something to be in italic. Okay, so we could go. Okay, so now we're setting font style. Italic. And remember, you got to put in your closing semicolon there, and I'll need to save. Go back over here and render. And now everything's switched to italic. Okay. I don't think I want that on my paragraphs, but we'll just leave it that way for now. Okay, so that's going to be your font style. Now let's do font size. Go back over to my CSS. Font size. We'll go to, let's do 12. And close that again. Might already be in 12. Let's see. Yeah, so let's change this to 10. Oh, so I'm not giving it the value of pixels, right? So font size needs to show, let's see, I think I have, yeah. So here, look, 22px. So you need to show that pixels. So I've now changed it to 10 pixels. Go back over here, file, save, re-render. Okay, and now it's changed the size of the font. So remember, you need to add the px so that it knows what increment you're changing, and that's too small, so I'm going to change it to 12. Okay, so that's font size. All right, so that's some basic CSS. I want you to go ahead and experiment with some of this CSS, and I will instruct you on what I want you to turn in to me to demonstrate that you understand how to add an external CSS style sheet to your HTML document. But starting to master some CSS will give you the ability to really improve the appearance of any website that you're working on. Of course, CSS is an absolute must.
Okay, everybody, so that is some basic CSS. And now I want to talk to you about what I need you to turn into me to demonstrate that you understand the CSS instruction that I've given you. And you're going to turn in 2 project folders to me. The first project folder, and both of them, of course, are going to be zipped and uploaded to this project. So the first project folder is going to contain internal and inline CSS. So remember, the internal CSS is CSS that styles the HTML document from inside of the header of your HTML. Okay, and inline CSS is just inside of an HTML tag and contains the styling just for that singular element that's included in there. Of course, you can rewind and watch the part of the video where I show you how to do inline CSS or internal CSS if you don't understand what to do. But for that one, all I want you to do is create the internal CSS, which will be in the header of your HTML document, and just do something like maybe what I did in the demonstration where I changed the color of all the H1 headers. Just some sort of simple internal CSS to style the HTML document. And then I want you to also include just one example of inline CSS. So what I recommend you do is just one of the paragraphs on your HTML document, just change the color of the text so that when I open up the document, it's pretty easy to me for me to see that you understood how to create the header in your HTML and put just a little bit of CSS styling inside of that header, and then also that you understand inline CSS by just on a single paragraph, not the entire paragraph element, not all paragraphs, but just a single paragraph. You're just going to add that inline styling to change the text in one of the paragraphs, okay? So that's going to show me just that when you turn in that zipped folder, that's going to be including your HTML, and it's also going to have your images folder with the images inside of it, and that's going to show me that you understand inline and internal CSS, okay? Now you're going to turn in a second zipped folder, which is going to have external CSS, and this one's going to be a little more involved. For the external CSS, in that CSS document, which is going to then need to be contained inside of a CSS folder entitled CSS, or actually I think in this one I called it food style. You can of course title that CSS document what you want, but it needs to have that .css file extension on it. Make sure you've got that. I want you to show me that you can change text color with that external CSS, change background color. I want it to include 2 fonts. So when I render your HTML website, I want to see 2 fonts that you've styled inside of that external CSS document. I also want you to use italics somewhere in the document, not for the entire document, but change some text, I don't care where, to italics and show me that you understand how to style something that way. In my example, I styled the paragraph font in italics. Also, I want you to use 2 different kind of fonts. So remember, I changed the font of the paragraph to Courier when everything else was in Times New Roman. Also, I want you to change the font size somewhere. So I want to be able to see inside of that document that there are 2 different font sizes and that you understand how to use CSS to style font sizes and change from the default font sizes. Okay, so I will have this all as written instructions for you also inside of the assignment, but that's what I want you to turn in. So you're going to turn in 2 zipped folders, and the naming convention will be in the assignment. It'll probably be something like CSS internal and CSS external, and turn both of those, upload those both to this assignment in Blackboard so that I can see you've grasped the basics of CSS that we've covered here. Thanks for all the hard work, everybody, and I look forward to seeing what you turn in.